Some towns never make it to the maps. Some men no longer need a name. El Rancho was one such place, and he was one such man. In a world where authority wears a badge and justice often rides in loud and fast, sometimes the strongest voice is silence. This is not a story of glory. It's the story of a quiet man, a wooden bench, and the day everything changed, without a single word spoken. The town of El Rancho sat tucked behind a small road, nestled at the foot of the southern Texas hills. No travel maps marked its location. No film studios chose it as a setting. Everything there was old, slow, and seemed untouched for decades. Afternoons in the town carried their own rhythm, slow and steady like a jazz tune with no climax. The wind blew across the tiled roof of the El Rancho restaurant, where the air always held the scent of grilled wood, spices, and kitchen smoke. Beneath its awning, an elderly man sat quietly on an old wooden bench. He didn't speak. He barely moved. He simply scattered handfuls of seeds to the sparrows fluttering at his feet. Every afternoon was the same, and no one asked why. People called him the old man who feeds the birds, but some, older folks, those who had lived in other cities, who had watched old action movies, whispered a name, Chuck Norris. No one could be sure. No one asked directly. Some claimed they'd seen him on TV. Some said he was a war veteran. Others said he was once famous, then vanished after a shootout no one talked about. But it all remained rumor. He never confirmed. He never denied it. He arrived each day at exactly 5:15 p.m. and sat at the same spot, the wooden bench near the granite column under the large almond tree. Each time, he carried a small cloth bag filled with seeds, and gently, little by little, he scattered them onto the pale gray cement where the sparrows had grown used to waiting. No one bothered him. At first, out of politeness. Later, because something kept them from breaking that moment. Not even with a greeting or a question. Rico, the restaurant's head chef, was the only one who had spoken to him. Just once, in Chuck's first week. "Need some water?" Rico had asked. Chuck nodded, took the glass, drank half, set it down in the exact same spot. Since that day, Rico has prepared a cool glass of water every afternoon, placing it exactly there, even if no one has mentioned it. One day, a little girl around 7 years old ran up and sat beside him. She didn't ask. She didn't seek permission. She just sat and watched the seeds fall, watched the birds chirping and scrambling. After a while, she reached out, took some seeds from his bag and scattered them too. Chuck didn't react. He simply handed her more seeds and continued watching the birds. That evening, she told her mother that the old man could summon birds with his hands. Her mother laughed and shook her head. But the next day, the girl returned. Gradually, more people took notice. Not out of curiosity anymore, but because they felt an odd sense of safety when he sat there. Some said the rowdy kids in front of the restaurant behaved better when he was around. Some claimed that the day he didn't show up, due to heavy rain, the restaurant was unusually empty. May, the restaurant owner, said Chuck brought a sense of order. "It's like he keeps the town breathing," she told Rico. "No one hired him, but he does it anyway. And you see, everything stays calm." But not everyone saw it that way. At the town's police station, Officer Brett Lansing started to take notice. He was new and had transferred from San Antonio. Young, tidy, by the book. To Lansing, everything had to have a reason. Nothing seemed more unreasonable than an unidentified elderly man sitting silently outside the restaurant every afternoon, without anyone questioning it. "Sits too long," he wrote in his notebook. "Doesn't order anything. No interaction. No ID. In contact with children." These notes, seemingly harmless, slowly turned into an obsession. Lansing couldn't understand why no one acted. He'd seen many incidents start with things that seemed harmless. What if this man was an eccentric, or worse, a wanted criminal, a fugitive? But what bothered Lansing most was the man's silence, his utter inactivity. Because you can't control someone who does nothing, there was no reason to detain him, no offense to write up, just a gnawing sense that Lansing was being challenged, quietly, unmistakably. And when Lansing read a handwritten letter from a child thanking the old man for letting her sit beside him and for the quiet safety he gave her, something in his mind snapped. Influencing minors, Lansing noted again, and in his head the confrontation had already begun. One afternoon, like every other, Chuck came. He sat down. Rico had already placed the water. But this time, before Chuck could even reach for the seed bag, a white patrol car slid into the parking lot. No sirens, no loudspeakers, yet its arrival seemed to rip the calm open. The car door swung wide. Lansing stepped out. Gloves already on. Boots polished. Eyes cold. The old man sat as always. The birds fluttered. And El Rancho was about to witness something it hadn't seen in years, a confrontation between official order and a presence that needed no validation. Chapter 2. Officer Lansing and the Seeds of Unfounded Suspicion. Brett Lansing wasn't the kind of officer who patrolled just for show. He believed in the system, believed in maintaining order through discipline. More than anything, he believed that where there was an uncontrolled space, a threat would surely arise. That firm belief had helped Lansing rise quickly through the ranks, and it was also what made him suspicious of anyone who existed outside the norms. In Lansing's eyes, El Rancho was a place that bred complacency. The townspeople were too lenient. They trusted what they called a feeling, rather than proper procedures. A man with no known identity, simply sitting quietly, becoming a symbol of safety for the entire street. Lansing saw danger in that. His suspicion didn't erupt overnight. It began with observation. He parked near the restaurant and spent a few minutes in his car, watching the old man through a small pair of binoculars. A weathered old man, tanned skin, gray beard, expression unreadable. The next day, Lansing came again, and the next. In his internal report, Lansing wrote, "Subject interacts only with minors. Identity unknown. Repetitive behavior is possibly linked to localized psychological influence." The clinical language showed that he no longer saw the man as a person, but as a potential threat. He requested the admin office to check resident records. No one named Chuck Norris lived in the area. No one with a temporary stay filed. No one matched the description. That only made Lansing more convinced that the man was hiding something. He spoke to no one about his suspicions, not to colleagues, not to locals, because he knew most of them liked the old man. And that, more than anything, disturbed Lansing. When a community began to place its faith in something unverified by the system, that was a sign of decay. The day he decided to make a move, Lansing was well prepared. He reviewed footage from the restaurant's exterior camera, nothing unusual. The man sat, birds arrived, a few children laughed, adults glanced, then walked on. But that nothing unusual bothered him. Because if someone wanted to hide, then showing nothing was the perfect disguise. That morning, Lansing drove around El Rancho, visited a F&W shops, casually chatted with some familiar faces. No one mentioned Chuck. Not a word. Not a comment. Not even a reaction. As if an unspoken rule dictated that he must not be mentioned. So that afternoon, Lansing decided to act. When the car pulled up in front of the restaurant, he didn't kill the engine, didn't step out right away. He sat there, watching the old man sitting just over 30 feet away. The birds, used to the car's sound, didn't scatter. Chuck remained still, as if nothing had changed. That irked Lansing. He stepped out. The door shut with a firm click. He didn't rush. His steps were slow, deliberate, announcing his presence. The air shifted. A few glances flicked out through the restaurant windows. Rico froze mid-motion in the kitchen. Lansing stopped in front of Chuck. The old man didn't look up. His hand kept scattering seeds. "What are you doing here?" Lansing asked. Clear voice, commanding tone. No reply. Lansing frowned, changed stance, leaned slightly forward. "I'll ask again. What is it you do here every day? What's your purpose?" Still no response. Chuck's gaze remained on the birds, his motions steady as if Lansing didn't exist. That was when Lansing sensed something different. No one had ever ignored him like that. Not civilians, not criminals, not even children. In Lansing's world, authority was acknowledged. But here it was being dismissed. Openly, weightlessly. He straightened, scanning the area. A few people were watching. A teenager stood in the parking lot with his phone up, pretending to text. Lansing knew exactly what that meant. He yanked his baton from his belt and slammed it against the armrest of the bench. "Do you have identification? I'm ordering you to present your ID now." The atmosphere thickened. Rico quietly put down his pan. May stepped forward from behind the counter, ready to speak, but stopped. Chuck didn't flinch. He tossed another handful of seeds. A bolder bird hopped onto his knee, resting comfortably. Lansing was losing his composure. He felt insulted, not by words, but by being ignored. This was no longer administrative. It was personal, and he, the law, could not allow it to go on. He tightened his grip on the baton. His jaw tensed. His other hand inched toward the holster. And, for the first time, Chuck looked up, straight into Lansing's eyes. That look, not threatening, not fearful, just absolute stillness, like deep, bottomless water, like a mirror reflecting all Lansing carried in his mind: doubt, anger, pride, and unease. The birds didn't fly away. They stood around him as if they too knew, in this moment, that if anyone laid a hand on him, everything would change forever. The moment Chuck Norris's eyes met his, Lansing felt like he had just stepped out of an invisible armor his uniform once provided. He, who believed he was the embodiment of order, suddenly felt irrelevant, powerless, no longer in control of the air around him. Chuck said nothing, just looked. And that look alone made Lansing's heart tighten, not out of fear, but from the sensation of being seen through to the core, as if every assumption, every control impulse, every judgment in his mind was laid bare before someone who didn't even need to furrow his brow to understand it all. But Lansing wouldn't retreat. He was a cop, a representative of the law. An old man could not make him falter. He growled again. "This is the last time I'll ask. Stand up and show your ID." No reaction, no movement, just a slight tilt of Chuck's head as he scattered the last of the seeds. One of the little birds, a brown-chested sparrow that Lansing had noticed before, hopped close to his boot, as if it too found his presence unthreatening. A chuckle came from inside the restaurant. Unclear whose, but Lansing heard it, loud and clear, and it made him angry. He stepped even closer, now just inches from Chuck's shoes. He slammed the baton on the bench again. The sound rang sharp, commanding attention. Chuck didn't move. Lansing's frustration was no longer official. It was personal. To him, being ignored was no longer a breach of law. It was a direct insult. His throat dried. Sweat began to bead on his brow, though it wasn't hot. Afternoon sunlight poured through the trees, spotlighting Lansing as if exposing him before a community he thought he controlled. He glanced to the side. Just as he suspected, at least 3 people were filming. A middle-aged man pretending to talk on his phone, but his camera aimed right at Lansing. A young woman peeking from behind a lamp-post, and a kid on a bike, with a GoPro mounted on the handlebars. Lansing couldn't back down. He knew if he walked away now, everything he'd built, his whole image, would collapse. Not in the eyes of his superiors, but in the eyes of the community. He reached out and touched Chuck's shoulder. Still no reaction. He squeezed lightly, and that was when everything changed. That thin, mottled arm, old, seemingly frail, suddenly tightened around Lansing's wrist with a grip that wasn't harsh but shockingly firm. Not painful, not violent. Just a whisper. That's enough. Lansing pulled back immediately, instinctively, and in that instant he felt defeated. No one who saw that interaction missed the truth. Lansing had just been stopped by an old man, with nothing more than a subtle gesture. Chuck let go immediately, gently, calmly, as if nothing had happened. But for Lansing, it had. That moment, brief, wordless, and unrecorded, was irreversible. He had been ignored, touched, and ultimately humbled, without a punch, without a shout, without any violent escalation to justify force in return. He looked around, and now the crowd made no effort to hide. They were watching. They were filming. Some had started murmuring. No one interfered. No one stepped in. But everyone saw, and Lansing knew. They were all waiting to see what he would do next. His hand, slowly and involuntarily, clenched tighter around the baton. Chuck sat back as he had before, hands resting on his knees, back straight, eyes no longer on Lansing but gazing calmly at the space ahead, as though what had just transpired wasn't even worth remembering. No one spoke, but everyone understood. And it was that silence that shook Lansing the most. No applause, no outcry, but the way the crowd looked at Chuck said everything. Respect didn't need cheers, but Lansing's loss of authority was visible in every glance, including the one from the fellow officer who had just stepped out of the patrol car. The junior officer, Martinez, a rookie recently assigned, stood motionless. He had never seen Brett Lansing like this. In his mind, Lansing was the model cop, rigid, sharp, uncompromising. But now, that man stood there, unarmed, unspoken, unable to respond. Chuck turned his head slightly and gave Martinez a glance. A nod, not a command, but a permission. A wordless message. You know what to do. Martinez stepped forward, calm, unhurried. He bent down, picked up the firearm, removed the magazine, pocketed it securely, Then he picked up the baton and clipped it to his own belt. After that, he stood before Lansing without a word. "You want to continue?" Martinez asked quietly, low enough for only the two of them to hear. Lansing looked at him as if waking from a trance. Then he looked around. The faces, the phones recording, Rico's eyes through the kitchen window, May behind the counter, the little sparrow still beside the bench. He swallowed hard, stepped back. Not because the old man was frightening, but because Lansing had just faced something he had never trained for his entire career. Righteousness without force. Strength without assertion. He turned around and walked away, not fast, but not slowly either. As he neared Martinez, he paused for a few seconds as if wanting to say something, but he stayed silent, just gave a slight nod. Martinez understood. He followed Lansing back to the patrol car, asking nothing more. The car backed out of the lot, turned onto the main road, and merged with the slow-moving vehicles of the late afternoon. The tension lifted. Phones were lowered. Curious onlookers dispersed. The El Rancho restaurant returned to the clatter of kitchen tools, the scent of frying oil and roasted coffee. Rico exhaled. May smiled faintly, pouring a fresh glass of herbal tea and placing it on the counter, as if the storm that had just passed was nothing more than a passing breeze. Chuck still sat there, silent. Brett Lansing didn't return to the station right after the incident. He drove around El Rancho like a machine, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, mind tangled like frayed wires. The images kept replaying in his head. The old hand gripping his wrist, the calm eyes void of fear, and, worst of all, the realization that his authority had been taken from him without a single strike. He, Officer Lansing, had just been dismantled by the mere presence of a man with no name, no weapon, no resistance, no blood, no bruises. But the wound was deep, in the place Lansing was most vulnerable, his pride. And that was why he turned around. An hour after leaving, Lansing spun the patrol car back toward the El Rancho restaurant. No backup, no protocol. He didn't need the system anymore. He needed something more personal, his dignity. It was late afternoon. The sun bled red behind the western trees. El Rancho remained peaceful as always, but when the patrol car pulled in for the second time that day, the air shifted again. Chuck was still there, still as a statue. No sign of surprise. It was as if he knew Lansing would come back, and knew exactly why. Lansing stepped out, not trying to project dominance this time. He moved quickly, decisively. No words, no formalities, just a stare, sharp, brimming with emotion. "You think you won, huh?" Lansing asked, voice rough with restraint. "You humiliated me in front of the whole town. You made me look like a fool, and you didn't even say a word." Chuck didn't respond, just looked at him, quietly. Lansing drew his baton again, but not to intimidate. It was the last symbol of power he had left. He raised it, but he didn't strike, because Chuck had stood up. No warning, no theatrics. He just stood. And Lansing, without knowing why, felt his body betray him. The baton fell from his hand before he realized he had let go. What was happening to him? He roared, trying to smother the feeling of losing control. "Don't think you can manipulate me with your eyes or your old man tricks. I'm not afraid of you." And he pulled his gun. This time he meant it. No cameras, no witnesses. Just two men, one calm, one enraged, bathed in the golden stretch of the gravel parking lot. Chuck didn't move. Lansing raised the gun. His finger curled around the trigger. And then Chuck stepped forward. Not fast, not threatening, just one step. But Lansing couldn't react. Chuck was suddenly in front of him, and the gun, in a blink, was no longer in Lansing's hand. Chuck didn't yank. He simply guided Lansing's wrist as if taking a remote from a child who refused bedtime. And the gun dropped. Not to the ground, but into Chuck's hand. He removed the magazine, took out the chambered round, placed everything gently on the bench. Then he turned. Didn't strike. Didn't retaliate. Just looked. And Lansing, at that moment, realized what he had never wanted to admit. Weapons don't define power. Guns, batons, badges, they're meaningless against someone ungoverned by fear. A soft click. Chuck lifted the bench and set it back precisely. Then he sat down, hands folded as though his task was complete. Lansing's shoulders slumped. His body went limp. He looked at his empty hands, then turned away. Not out of shame, but because he understood. He had entered a battle he didn't have the calm to win. And Chuck, the man who didn't speak, didn't hurt, didn't claim anything, had taught him the deepest lesson of strength. The next morning, Lansing arrived at the El Rancho police station on time. His uniform was crisply ironed, badge affixed in its proper place. But his eyes were different, no longer cold or calculating, deeper now, quiet, like someone who had walked through a storm alone. The small meeting room inside the station was unusually full. Captain Howard sat at the center. Beside him were two internal affairs officers from the county. At the far end of the room stood Martinez, arms crossed. On the table, a thick folder and a USB stick, holding the video that had already swept through the town. Howard didn't waste time. "Brett, you know why you're here." Lansing nodded. No excuses. One of the IA officers opened a laptop, played the video. Silence. They watched it all. Lansing stepping out, approaching Chuck, then losing control. The disarmament, the stillness, the surrender. When it ended, no one spoke right away. Howard exhaled and flipped through the file. No formal complaints, no injuries, but what the people saw was an officer out of control, a gun drawn, and a man, unarmed, who calmly disarmed him in front of the town. Martinez spoke up. His tone was neutral, not accusatory, just clear. No further testimony needed. The footage says it all. Lansing looked up. He knew this wasn't a trial, nor was it a disciplinary hearing. It was a reckoning, a quiet moment for everyone to decide who still deserved to wear the badge. Howard didn't ask questions. He simply placed an envelope on the table. Inside it, a resignation form. No orders, just a choice. Lansing stared at the paper, then at each person in the room, and he understood. It wasn't about defending himself. It was about protecting the meaning of the badge, by knowing when to take it off. He rose, walked out of the station slowly, envelope in hand. No one escorted him. No one needed to say goodbye. Everything had already been said in silence, in glances, in Howard's subtle nod as Lansing placed the envelope on the desk. Outside, the sunlight spilled across dusty awnings. A normal day began in El Rancho, but for Lansing, it was the first time he stepped out without being a cop. No longer the enforcer of justice, just a man. No sirens, no cuffs, no scuffle. Yet he had lost the greatest thing in his life without a single shot being fired. The news spread quickly, without reporters. No one gossiped loudly, but no one was surprised either. That afternoon, the El Rancho restaurant was busier than usual. Not because people were hungry, but because they wanted to see. Chuck still sat in his familiar spot. The same wooden bench. The same birds fluttered down to peck at the seeds. Everything seemed unchanged, except for one thing. The former symbol of authority was no longer present. A few guests looked his way, tempted to say something, but none did. Because in their eyes he wasn't just the old man feeding birds. He was the man who won without fighting. And Lansing. He didn't come to El Rancho that evening. He sat alone in his small apartment, fingers tracing each word on the resignation letter. Though he had signed it, only now did it truly sink in. Losing the badge hadn't broken him. Losing the gun hadn't shaken him. But losing faith in himself, that had made him fall. That evening, like every other, Chuck Norris sat on his familiar wooden bench in front of the El Rancho restaurant. He carried his small cloth bag full of seeds, scattering them gently onto the ground in a quiet, unbroken ritual. The birds were used to him now. They no longer feared. They came close, perched on his legs, on the bench arms, sometimes even on his knee. Everything had returned to its rightful place. No tension, no confrontation. The restaurant reopened. People came and went. The clang of pans and the scent of oil and spices filled the air. May quietly placed a glass of herbal tea on the side table next to Chuck, like always. No one mentioned what had happened. In El Rancho, people had their own way of remembering the extraordinary, without many words. A young boy approached, holding a piece of paper behind his back. On it was a scribbled drawing of Chuck and his birds. "I drew this for you," he mumbled. Chuck smiled and took it. "Thank you," he said. That was all. But his eyes lit up, not with pride, but with the quiet knowledge that he was still present in the right way. Without saying a word, he remained part of this place. Not a symbol, not a legend, just a man, present, quiet, doing no harm, but powerful enough to shift an entire system. Days later, Lansing was no longer seen around town. He left quietly, like a shadow dissolving into morning mist. No one blamed him. No one praised him. But the echo of that confrontation remained, not in stories, but in how people now looked at one another, in how they listened before reacting, in how they began to ask, "Is this really necessary?" before imposing anything on someone else. The bench was still there. Chuck was still there. And the birds still came. No one called him a hero. But in an age where everyone tries to shout to prove they're right, there was one man who chose silence. And won, without having to defeat anyone at all. No medals, no headlines, no fanfare. Just one man, who sat still when the world demanded noise. And sometimes that's all it takes to remind us. Power doesn't always shout. Justice doesn't always arrive in sirens. And dignity. Sometimes it simply sits on a bench, feeds the birds, and waits for the world to catch up.